Hi, and welcome to the next section on the major arcana that I've been doing. It's been a few days since I did the last one, so I thought we were due, and I thought I'd do one before I went to bed, literally being in bed. um, but today we're going to be talking about the Hanged Man. Um, this is a card that I probably did not particularly like. In his book, he tells us that it is a particularly ominous card. Basically, that um, it's a dark card. It's a card of restriction and almost slavery and punishment that may or may not be deserved. But the interesting thing about it that he also tells us is that because of its very watery nature, it is incredibly elusive, with an I, not E, um, elusive, um, and therefore it is easily misinterpreted. Or, in general, the theme of this card is misinterpreted by society, um, particularly Judeo-Christian morality, is what he's getting at. Of course, sorry. Um, of course, the card is a dead ringer for well, I shouldn't say dead ringer because you might not necessarily see it obviously, but it is, the nails in the hands and feet are a dead ringer for Christ, of course, and the whole idea of the Passion. And so this card is sort of where the Passion takes place in the tarot. Um, it is the major hieroglyph of that. Um, but the idea is that that whole story is of the previous aeon, and so is therefore um, meant to be either done away with or reinterpreted in a way that makes the previous interpretations almost moot. I think the idea of the new aeon is that the previous aeons are destroyed, and of course that doesn't really make much sense to me, frankly, but that's what we're told. Um, Especially because we know human history is evolving. It's a process of, I think, evolution and cycles. Um, but one thing leads to another. So I can't really agree that things have been entirely destroyed. Um, but the whole idea of this card is one of self-sacrifice. And Crowley's big thing was against the idea of self-sacrifice. And I think the dangerous thing about this card is, as he would say, that self-sacrifice has become a kind of, how do I want to phrase this? It's sort of the go-to basis for Western morality. And I think for a lot of human morality in general, I think that um, people around the world in all sorts of different cultures, it's why we have manners. Every culture has manners of some kind, social graces. And I think part of that comes from this desire to deprecate oneself for others. Um, but I think what this card is trying to explain is why we have that complex. Because, to talk about it Kabbalistically for a second, the card means, well, the card is the letter Mem, and Mem is the ocean, um, and also it is the path that is between Geburah and Hod. So this is a card that is directly opposite the Wheel of Fortune, as I talked about in that card. And so it is the exact opposite of the Wheel of Fortune, but connected to it, in its opposition to it. And so I think that is the idea that, whereas the Wheel of Fortune represented, or rather Fortune represented benevolence and kind of the gifts God gives you, this card is very much not that. It is the opposite of that. It is the punishments that God gives you. But I think, as we talked about, there really are no punishments. Everything that we interpret as bad um, is an illusion, and it is a way of maintaining that separation between ourselves and the root cause of our experiences, which is a deeper part of self that the knowledge of would lead to transcendence of the smaller self, basically, as I call it, the ego, basically. It would lead to our personal destruction, essentially. So, in some ways, we need to meditate on pain in order to maintain the ego, and we need to believe that we are being punished. I think we have the idea of punishment also from Geburah, but also the idea of restriction and from the whole pillar of severity. And I think, his posture, the whole limitation that he is subject to, this is very much a card that represents, I think, man's fear of his own limitations and his own imperfections and his own, Geburah is also the energy of man. And I think it's also the idea that man's energy has only so much capability. I think this is one of those things, the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. It's kind of like man, because we live in a body, because our body is subject to limitations like hunger, exhaustion, these are the limiting factors on our personal capabilities for a day, a week, etc. I think we tend to, as a result, see our personal existence as very limited and therefore very controlled by outside forces. And therefore, this card is very much about illusion and but also punishment or the illusion of punishment, but about restriction and limitation. Um, Now, the issue that comes with this, of course, is that if we are to live glorifying God in the body, as St. Paul tells us to, how are we exactly supposed to do that while convincing ourselves that we are powerless? I think that's really what this card is getting at. It's the convincing that man has done to himself psychologically, or herself psychologically, um, that we are powerless, and we are not. Um, but it's very easy to stay in this position or this posture. It's very easy to pretend that this is what it's all about, that this is the true reality. And I think the bulk of the other cards and just the bulk of human experience tells us that there is more to life than just this. And perhaps this is partially what we're getting at with the serpent, but that's not really what the serpent is meaning in this particular card. But the serpent is, of course, a symbol of wisdom, and as you know, the weight version of this card is a symbol of enlightenment. Taking a break, it's a meditative card. But I really think that that's more about the hermit. I really don't think Waite quite had it right. But of course, Waite was talking about a number of different things that weren't necessarily Cabalistic. I mean, if we're talking about the Hanged Man as the path between Geburah and Hod, Hod is the intellect of man. It is the brain of man basically saying, I have X dependencies that limit my functionality in the world around me. Therefore, I cannot be divine. I cannot partake in the divine. I cannot see life as any more than the mundane muck that it is. And so I think what Crowley did when he designed this card with Lady Frida Harris was that he tried to show it in a way that shows it in its true form. That restriction is therefore not, or self-restriction and self-sacrifice is not necessarily a good thing for morality. It does not mean that you need to constantly subjugate yourself to other people and deface yourself and punish yourself because you're weak. Asceticism is not the answer either, or there's no real inherent moral integrity to asceticism, just as there's no real inherent integrity to gluttony either. But of course, asceticism is seen as more virtuous, and it's not really. You are denying your real existence as connected to God, which is transcendent and incapable of really punishing, I think, is the point. So by depicting this card with the green circles, his foot suspended from this ankh. The ankh is, of course, the symbol of life in Egyptian hieroglyphics, but it is also connected to the Tau, letter Tau. Then the Tau means a cross, and of course the cross is very much connected to Christ. But also we have the light of Keter up here. Some person on YouTube was saying, and I again will not mention this man's name, but he was saying that it's green, and so, but it's also solar, and so therefore, it isn't really solar. Maybe it's a lunar quality. And no, the answer is that it's green because green is associated with Venus, if you knew anything about anything. And the idea is that God is infinite love. That is what we are getting at in the green light up here of Keter, or Kether. That God is such infinite love for his creation, for his manifested self, that how can he really ever punish it? It's more about a teachable moment, and sometimes not sparing the rod, so to speak, is about teaching out of love. It's sort of the idea that every punishment is an act of love. Every act is an act of love. Or rather, every experience is an act of love between us and God. And I think that's what this is getting at, with the serpent being that, the serpent is associated with Hokmah, and the will of God, and the wisdom of God, and that is what binds the man's foot to life and the source of life. The man's life, the man's subjective experience, is directly connected to the wisdom of God and the will of God and the unending love of God. So this is a beautiful card, and in the way that he has chosen to depict it. Of course, we have the triangle on the bottom formed by his arms, and then the cross on top. The triangle surmounted with the cross is a symbol of light entering the darkness. And of course, this being associated with the sea, the ocean, we are of course reminded of the Divine Feminine, but the Sea of Bina, and essentially the field of potential experience. The feminine is the universe in its latent form of just chaotic, infinite potential, but no real driving force behind it yet. That is what the idea of the feminine is. And I think the idea is that out of love for that creation, God creates something that can move within that body, within that ocean. And by moving in it, it gives it life. And by giving it life, it redeems it and saves it from death. So again, as we would say, the passion is not about death, it is about life. Our struggles are about life and not death. And of course the serpent on the bottom is reminding us of that. The serpent is black, flecked gold, essentially, which is a symbol of the lowest of the low. Those colors are essentially the 10th path of the Sephiroth, Malkut, on the princess scale, which is the lowest scale of color. Of course, there are scales of color that were basically determined based on astral visions that people in the 19th century had. But it's essentially, of course, a system of determining what colors are associated with different regions of the Sephiroth at different planes. And essentially the different scales associated, the king scale is Atziluth, the queen scale is Bria, the prince scale is Yetzirah, and excuse me, the princess scale is Asaya. And so, or Asiya, I don't know, my Hebrew, is very mediocre. So the serpent is a symbol of the Princess of Discs in some ways, of Earth, the lowest of the low. And she's in, or it, rather, in this case, is in this little, like, black almond shape. The almond is a symbol of the mandorla, essentially. And the mandorla in itself is a symbol of the womb. So essentially this is taking the latent energy, again, of the feminine and redeeming it by giving it purpose and connecting it to God. And of course by connecting it to an anchor, essentially, it is restricting itself. It is the idea that God has restricted itself out of love in order to generate a creation and redeem its creation. But it's not like that creation did anything wrong that required that redemption. There is the debt that man feels to God is an illusion, is what this card is saying. That you cannot be indebted to a God because you are made by a God, and you are in turn, as a result, a God yourself. And you have your own divine purpose that it is your duty and divine responsibility to fulfill. And that limitation of path, this is also a card that says you can only be what you are. You cannot be anything that you are not. And I know that's sort of a simplistic statement, but it's very true. I am never going to be, I don't know. I'm never going to be you, plain and simple. I'm never going to be you, and you're never going to be me. And that's also what this card is getting at, as far as the restriction of existence. You can only be that which you were made to be. And you were made in a certain shape, and with certain abilities, out of love. So this is a beautiful card. This is not usually one of my favorites, but tonight I'm particularly moved by it. It is the element of water, so it is part of a trinity with, my little reading light is really bright today. It's part of a trinity rather, with the Fool, which is the element of air, and the Aeon, which is the element of fire, and spirit, because they share similar properties. And technically you could consider it part of a quadrangle, I suppose, or a quadrad? I don't know. A team, we'll say. of the Fool, the Anne, and also the universe. The universe is the element of Earth. It just is, sometimes we forget that it's also the element of Earth in addition to the planet Saturn. So technically it's really four. We say that it's more of a trinity because the Earth one doesn't really count as much. The really important elements are fire, water, and air. It does not mean that we need to discount Earth or say that Earth is bad or evil. Matter is not evil inherently, like some people want to say it is. But it is the conglomeration of the first three that are more real in the metaphysical sense. So yes, I think that's about all I want to say about this. It's very much an issue of placement on the Tree of Life, and yeah, and of course it is the exact opposite of the Wheel of Fortune as we were talking about. So that's definitely something you might want to think about. And I think the other interesting thing is that lust is very much the balance between the two. Remember that lust goes between, number 11 goes between Chesed and Geburah, and whereas the Wheel of Fortune is very much about Chesed, and the Hanged Man is very much about Geburah, lust is about the two of them together. And so again, it has to do with that. Lust is about that receptivity and activity at the same time, the magnetic attraction between passive and active. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say. So thank you for checking in, and I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, comments, please leave them below. Don't forget to please like these videos so that people can actually find them. It'd be cool. And I will see you next time for number 13, Death. Bye now.